We're going to start by having counsel identify yourselves for the record, please, starting with counsel for the state. Happy again, please raise your hand. Morning, I can be
Good morning.
Morning, Your Honor. For Danielle Dauphinais.
Morning, Your Honor. Legal version for Danielle Dauphinais.
Okay.
Ms. Dauphinais.
Good morning.
So, Ms. Dauphinais, we're going to start by having you stand, and I'm going to ask that you state your name for the record. Thank you. If you could raise your right hand, the best that you can. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under the pains and penalties of perjury? I do. Thank you. You can put your hand down. I just have some paperwork to review with you. Your attorney has submitted an acknowledgement, a waiver of rights, and also a waiver of sentence review. Did you go through that paperwork with your attorneys? Great. On those forms, there is a signature line above where it says defendant. Your attorney has electronically added your signature. Has that been done with your permission? Thank you very much.
Okay, I understand that you intend to plead guilty today. And this is a capped plea, correct? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the state to explain what it is that they will be seeking, and I'm going to come back to you and ask if that's what you expected to hear, okay? Please approach. My apologies. Okay, so will the state please describe what sentence it will be seeking?
Absolutely, Your Honor. With respect to this capped plea, the state has offered the defendant a capped plea to the charge of second-degree murder of knowing. That cap is 55 years incarceration to life. The state would intend on seeking the 55 years to life at sentencing. In addition to that charge, the defendant is pleading guilty today to 2 counts of tampering with a witness. Each of those has a penalty of 3.5 to 7 years incarceration. The tampering with witness charges would run concurrently to one another, but the defendant has agreed that the 3.5 to 7 year sentence for those together would run consecutively to any sentence imposed on the second-degree murder charge. So the state at sentencing will be seeking its total sentence of 58.5 years to life incarceration.
Okay. Of course. Okay, I'll ask that you stand. I have a couple of questions for you for the moment. Are those the terms that you were expecting to hear? Do you understand that a separate sentencing hearing has been scheduled for after your plea of guilty? And at that hearing, the court will listen to arguments and hear evidence from both your attorney and from the state as to what sentence should be imposed. And then after considering all of the evidence and arguments, the judge presiding over that hearing will make a decision as to what the appropriate sentence will be. Do you understand that under the terms of the capped plea, the court will be able to impose any sentence up to the cap? Do you further understand that if it turns out that the judge agrees with the state and imposes the maximum allowed under the terms of the cap, you will not be able to withdraw your plea even if you disagree with the court's decision? All right, you may be seated for the moment, and I'll turn to the state. If this had proceeded to trial, what facts would the state have been able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt?
If this case had proceeded to trial, the state would rely on the following evidence to prove that the defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of the crimes sought here, which is second-degree murder knowing and 2 counts of tampering with witnesses. Because this is a bifurcated plea and sentencing hearing, there will be additional facts of guilt the state would rely on at the sentencing phase, but we will not present them all here today. On May the 26th of 2020, 4-year-old Elijah Lewis was moved from Arizona to New Hampshire by his father, Timothy Lewis. That evening, Elijah's mother, the defendant, Danielle Dauphinais, seated to my left at trial table, met Timothy Lewis in the parking lot at the Pheasant Lane Mall in Nashville. Timothy Lewis at that time left Elijah with the defendant and her boyfriend, Joseph Staff. Elijah was carrying a single backpack containing a few of his belongings, and the defendant had not seen Elijah in over 3 years. Under State's Exhibit 1, which has been agreed on as a full exhibit, shows how Elijah appeared shortly after he arrived in the state of New Hampshire. This is Elijah as he arrived in May of 2020, looking healthy, looking happy. Timothy Lewis, after he dropped Elijah off with the defendant, returned to Arizona, and Elijah began living at 7 Sunset Drive in Merrimack with the defendant, with her boyfriend, Joseph Staff, with their 2-year-old child, female daughter named J.S. Joseph Staff's mother, Joanne Staff, owned the home that they lived in, and she resided on the 1st floor, while Ms. Dauphinais, the defendant, Mr. Staff, and the children lived in the basement. The defendant was the primary caretaker for both Elijah and JS. She stayed home most of the time, and Mr. Staff primarily worked outside of the home. The investigation in this case revealed that at least between September 27, 2020 and September 21st, 2021, the charged period of conduct with respect to the homicide, Elijah was assaulted, starved, isolated, and neglected. He was tortured. If called to testify at trial, Dr. Cindy Christian of the Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania would have testified that child torture refers to a child who endures an extended period of time characterized by at least 2 physical assaults or 1 extended assault, 2 or more forms of psychological maltreatment, and neglect, which results in prolonged suffering, permanent disfigurement, or death. Dr. Christian reviewed the case file for this case, and she concluded that Elijah suffered from torture, repeated physical assaults, ongoing psychological maltreatments, including emotional rejection, denigration, isolation, and denial of care. She found severe physical neglect, all of these things resulting in Elijah Lewis's death. Remember, before we turn our attention to the death of Elijah Lewis here today, it's important that the court understands some of his background while he was in New Hampshire and how investigators in New Hampshire even became involved in this case. On January 15th of 2020, before Elijah was dropped off in New Hampshire, at a well-child visit with his pediatrician in Arizona, Elijah was measured to be 3 feet, 1.25 inches tall, and he was found to weigh 30 pounds, 2 ounces. Elijah's birthday, the day he was born, January 7th, 2016, means that at that time, he had just turned 4 years old. Moving forward to after he arrived in New Hampshire, in early October of 2020, Timothy Lewis filed a complaint with the New Hampshire Division of Children, Youth, and Families about concerns he had that Elijah wasn't receiving proper medical care. That complaint opened a DCYF assessment and documented that Elijah was living in New Hampshire with the defendant at 70 Sunset Drive in Merrimack. Text message communications recovered during the investigation show that on October 14th of 2020, the same month where that complaint was filed, the defendant sent an image of Elijah to Joseph's staff via text messaging, saying, "Look at this fucking kid's face." In the photo, Elijah has an apparent bruise on his forehead. His eyes appear swollen and partially closed. The next day, October 15th, the defendant sent a message to Joseph's staff saying that she had just received a call from their DCYF worker and that her heart had dropped because she thought maybe someone called us. On October 28th, 2020, the day before the scheduled DCYF assessment meeting, the defendant sent a text message to Joseph's staff saying, "I had to be easy on Elijah today because of what's going on, so I gave him a bubble bath with toys." And the staff agreed, "Yes, we have to be careful." From records obtained during the investigation, it's apparent that Elijah was taken for medical treatment only one time while he resided in the state of New Hampshire with the defendant. That visit occurred on November 22nd of 2020. The records from that visit give us 3 important pieces of information. First, at the time of that visit, Elijah weighed 32 pounds, 3 ounces. Second, the defendant told the doctors that Elijah was leaving New Hampshire the next week and would be moving back to Arizona, an event that was not planned to occur and did not happen. 3, doctors noted bruises on Elijah's face, his left eye, and his right arm. These bruises prompted doctors to report observations to the DCYF, which opened a second case about Elijah. Moving forward to January of 2021. On January the 8th of 2021, the defendant, in a phone call with her DCYF worker, reported to DCYF that Elijah no longer lived with her. She stated that Elijah had been sent to live with her sister, Tracy Dauphinais, in California. This option had been discussed with DCYF, Tracy Dauphinais, and indeed with Timothy Lewis over the course of the open investigations. In fact, Timothy Lewis signed over custody of Elijah to Tracy Dauphinais, the defendant's sister, but the defendant never completed the paperwork to do that. Because of the defendant's lie to DCYF, the investigations were closed. Moving forward much further, October the 7th of 2021. On that date, the defendant gave birth to an infant boy during a home birth inside of 7 Sunset Drive to Merrimack. On October 10th of 2021, 3 days later, Joseph's staff dropped that infant at the Catholic Medical Center in Manchester. This began a DCYF investigation into Joseph's staff, Danielle Dauphinais, and the residents of 7 Sunset Drive. On October 10th, officers with the Merrimack Police Department went to that home where they met with the defendant and Joseph's staff, as well as with Joseph's staff's mother, Joanne. If called to testify at trial, Officer Dunash of the Merrimack Police Department would state that the defendant and Joseph's staff told him that they had originally lived in the basement, but had moved to the first floor because of renovations happening. But when he went to look in the basement, they stopped him from doing so. Officer Dudash would testify that as he looked around the first floor of the home, there were no signs that a little boy had lived there. 4 days later, on October 14th, the Child Protective Services worker was assigned to the infants case and reviewed the history of family assessments with respect to the defendant, Ms. Dauphinais. At 8:07 in the morning, according to phone records, that worker called the defendant and asked her where Elijah was. The defendant told the worker that Elijah was gone, that he had left. The worker asked her what that meant, and the defendant said, he's gone. The worker confronted her again and said a 5-year-old doesn't just walk away. The defendant then said that Elijah was with her sister, Tracy Dauphinais, in California. The defendant then began sending messages to and calling Tracy Dauphinais. The defendant's phone records, in fact, show 87 contacts, messages, and phone calls between the defendant and Tracy Dauphinais on October 14th between 8:25 a.m. and 12:47 p.m. At 12:45 p.m., DCYF worker would testify that she called Tracy Dauphinais in California and asked her about Elijah. Tracy Dauphinais reported to that worker that she did not have Elijah, had never had Elijah, and that she hadn't seen him over video calls in months. She expressed her continued desire to have Elijah. Tracy told the worker and later told investigators with the New Hampshire State Police and Merrimack Police that the defendant contacted her earlier the day of the October 14th, 2021, and that in those contacts, the defendant asked Tracy to lie. She asked Tracy to tell investigators that Elijah was with her when he was not, and Tracy refused to do so. At 1:03 p.m. and again at 1:18 p.m., again on October the 14th of 2021, according to cell phone records, the defendant was again confronted by DCYF workers about Elijah. She asked why. The worker told her that Elijah wasn't in California with her sister, at which point the defendant told the worker that she had sent Elijah to her brother's house. In bits and pieces, question by question, she told DCYF that her brother's name was Bruce Rowland. He was later identified by investigators as Bruce Scherzer. She told investigators that Bruce lived in Texas and eventually provided a phone number for him, but could not give an address. The defendant told the worker that Elijah had been in Texas since September sometime. And looking at her phone records, investigators found that there were 17 contacts, messages, and calls between the defendant and Bruce Scherzer on October 14th, 2021, between 1:12 p.m. and 8:36 p.m. At 1:45 p.m. on October 14th of 2021, according to DCYF records, the worker called Bruce Scherzer, and he said he did have custody of Elijah. Notably, Mr. Scherzer could not provide any information about Elijah. No school, no location. He said he'd had Elijah in Texas since September. Because he couldn't provide workers with information they were asking for, he was told to call them back. He never did. Shortly thereafter, DCYF responded to the lobby of the Merrimack Police Department and reported that Elijah Lewis was missing. After several hours, and with the assistance of officers from the Merrimack Police Department and the Fort Worth, Texas Police Department, investigators were able to find out that Bruce Scherzer did not have Elijah Lewis with him in Texas, and that he never had. Bruce Scherzer spoke with officers and advised that he last knew Elijah to be in the custody of the defendant in New Hampshire. He told officers she had contacted him on October 14th of 2021 and asked him to lie to investigators and say that he had Elijah. He agreed to lie. Further, Mr. Scherzer sent investigators during his case copies of text messages that were sent to him by the defendant in which she asked him to lie. Your Honor, States Exhibits 2A and 2B, which are admitted as full exhibits here, show Bruce Scherzer's exchange of messages with the defendant concerning Elijah. The first message was received by Bruce at approximately 1:26 p.m. New Hampshire time. You'll see on the screen at the top of each message that says 12:26. New Hampshire time is actually 1 hour ahead. It stated in that message, the defendant wrote, September 10th, Friday, you came and got him. You drove up and got him. In States Exhibit 2B, Your Honor, which is attached there, you can see the moment where Bruce Scherzer starts to go back on his lie. In fact, he's confronting the defendant and asking her what she got him into and telling her to get him out of it. He didn't know that it was more than just a wellness check, and she needed to have people stop blowing up his phone. Your Honor, officers with the Merrimack Police Department contacted the defendant at 3:16 p.m., so 2 hours after she had provided Mr. Scherzer with information about saying you have Elijah. During that phone call at 3:16 p.m., the defendant and Joe's staff agreed that they would respond to the Merrimack Police Department by 4:30 p.m. in order to sign paperwork related to their infant child. They did not respond to the Merrimack Police Department. In fact, Your Honor, records recovered during this investigation show that at approximately 3:16 p.m., as shown in State's Exhibit 3, which is as a full exhibit, shows that the defendant and Joseph's staff, while the defense was on the phone with the Merrimack Police Department, were at the Digital Federal Credit Union in Nashville, New Hampshire, where Joseph's staff used Joanne's staff's credit card to take $1,000 out of her bank account. The defendant and Mr. Staff did not respond again to the Merrimack Police Department after this withdrawal, but they went to the Target store in Burlington, Massachusetts, State's Exhibit 4, Your Honor, where they purchased new cellular phones to replace the devices that they were currently using. At the Target store, they purchased clothing and toiletries. They were in the Target for approximately 1 hour. And Your Honor, based on the investigation to date, at this time, the body of Elijah Lewis was in the back of Joseph's staff's truck, parked in the Target parking lot. Your Honor, investigators were able to trace the defendant and Mr. Staff's whereabouts through their phones and through their social media accounts, and this is through their original phones that were known to investigators. Records showed that they had gone to this Target location, and investigators were able to find information about these new phones. So investigators were then able to use their new phones to follow their movements further. The records from their phones showed that the defendant and Mr. Staff traveled through Boston and then arrived at the area of Ames Knoll State Park in Abington, Massachusetts by approximately 11:15 p.m. on October 14th of 2021. This is almost 14 hours, Your Honor, after investigators first began asking about Elijah Lewis. At this location, Your Honor, Elijah Lewis's body would later be located by Trooper David Lyon and Canine Amos Davidoff of the New Hampshire State Police Canine Unit. The defendant and Mr. Staff remained at the location in Ames Knoll State Park for over an hour, close to 2. They didn't leave until about 12:52 in the morning on October the 15th of 2021. Recovered from their phones were messages that they exchanged while they were at that location. These communications are related to Elijah Lewis's body. From Miss Dauphinais, you okay? Back to Mr. Staff, had to get through a swamp, FML. From Miss Dauphinais, are you serious? Keep me posted. From Mr. Staff, this is tough. Big roots. Let me try. I have to get it done. Oh. From Dauphinais, okay. Mr. Staff, getting there. Dauphinais, we've got to figure out where we're going to go next. From Miss Dauphinais' phone at 11:48 p.m. that evening, doesn't have to be big. Almost ready? Mr. Staff, no. I thought I heard something. From Miss Dauphinais, you're good, babe. Don't worry. I just don't want to sit here for much longer. From Mr. Staff, I'm getting there, baby. I'm getting there. Using hands a lot. From Miss Dauphinais, how much longer do you think? It doesn't have to be far down, you know. Missed you already, Dave. I love you more than anything. Your Honor, Mr. Staff was burying Elijah Lewis's body in those moments and during his texts. Once Elijah's body was discarded, the defendant and Joseph Staff continued their flight from the state of New Hampshire. They traveled through Littleton, Massachusetts, where on October 15th at about 11 in the morning, the defendant withdrew $200 from an ATM. They then drove through Air, Massachusetts, where the defendant threw the old cellular phones out of the window. The defendant later admitting in a recorded jail call that she chucked her phone in the river because she didn't want to be trapped. Members of the Merrimack Police Department recovered Joseph Staff's old cellular phone from a pond where it was found by 2 boys who were out fishing. The defendant's old phone was never found. The defendant and Joseph Staff then traveled to the Mohegan Sun Casino in Uncasville, Connecticut, arriving there on October 15th at about 7:43 p.m. Once they parked in the garage, the defendant and Mr. Staff entered the casino. They purchased food. They spent approximately 45 minutes at a country music concert inside of the Wolf Den, and then they returned to the parking garage, sleeping inside of their vehicle. At about 11:30 the next morning, October the 16th of 2021, the defendant and Mr. Staff gathered their belongings, abandoned their vehicle, left the parking garage, and boarded a bus on their way to New York. On October 17th, the next day, both the defendant and Mr. Staff were arrested inside a subway station in the Bronx, New York. Following her arrest, the defendant was read Miranda rights, waived them, and agreed to speak with members of New Hampshire State Police. The defendant told those officers that in September, Elijah had wandered away from their home. She said they looked for him, but hadn't found him and had never reported him missing. Joseph's staff told officers the exact same story and later told investigators that that was the lie they agreed to tell if they got caught. On October the 18th of 2021, investigators from the Mohegan Tribal Police Department and the Connecticut State Police conducted a search of the vehicle that the defendant and staff were using. This is Mr. Staff's Toyota Tundra. Showing Your Honor State's Exhibit 3, I apologize. I think I'm on 4. 6. I apologize. I skipped one, Your Honor, so I want to make sure I have the right one. Showing the court state's Exhibit 6A, which is a full exhibit. This shows Mr. Staff Tundra at the Connecticut State Police garage. During this search of Mr. Staff's Tundra, they recovered an envelope on which was written a story about Elijah leaving the house in September. In addition to that envelope, investigators found several trash bags in the bed of the vehicle. It's case B. Investigators searched each of those trash bags, State 6C, and they recovered several items of property that belonged to Elijah in among the household trash. Looking at State's Exhibit 6D, these items included books, coloring books, Exhibit 16. Some of those coloring books with Elijah's name written on them, crayon and block childlike writing. It also included in State's Exhibit 6E a backpack with cars and trucks on it and a Spider-Man doll. On October the 22nd of 2021, based on data that had been received from the defendant's cellular phones, investigators from the Massachusetts State Police and the New Hampshire State Police began searching in the area of Ames Knoll State Park. Looking at State's Exhibit 7, if called to testify at trial, Your Honor, Trooper David Lyon would testify that he, when he was in this area near where the red mark is on this map, could smell an odor of decay, and that his canine dog, Amos, was showing indications that he too detected the odor of human remains, but they could not immediately locate the source. At approximately 6 o'clock that evening, the search was called off because of the dark. Trooper Lyon marked the location inside of the park in order to return it to it in the daylight. On October 23rd, 2021, Trooper Lyon began searching the same area of the park. He identified shovel marks in this area of the park, showing State's Exhibit 8A. Your Honor, with that arrow pointing out what David Lyon would have testified indicated to him that the soil had been disturbed and those dark markings were shovel marks. Inside of this area, marked by that black circle on State's Exhibit 8A, we moved into State's Exhibit 8B, which marks the burial location of Elijah Lewis. In State's Exhibit 8B, Trooper Lyon would testify that he could tell in this area that the soil had been disturbed and that the white birch tree up at the top of the exhibit was not in a normal place where it would have been. There was no stump where it had fallen from and no other reason that it was landed in that direction. Your Honor, Elijah Lewis's body was found in this dirt. It was a shallow hole and was found face down in the fetal position. State's Exhibits 9A through 9B, I can provide to the court. May I confirm?
Yes, please.
Now, State Exhibits 9A and 9B, which the court has in front of it now, show how Elijah's body was positioned in the burial site and his appearance once his body was recovered. Dr. Richard Atkinson of the Massachusetts Office of the Chief Medical Examiner was present at the burial site to help remove Elijah's body. He also conducted an autopsy of Elijah. During autopsy, Dr. Atkinson found that Elijah was just 36 inches tall and that he weighed only 19 pounds. Reminding the court that when Elijah was last weighed in November of 2020, he was at a weight of 32.3 pounds. If called to testify at trial, Dr. Atkinson would have testified that Elijah's body was significantly emaciated, with loss of skeletal muscle and no subcutaneous fat. That these two situations were independent of the decomposition of his body. He would state that he was unable to complete an examination of Elijah's brain or spine for injuries because of decomposition. Dr. Atkinson would also testify that during autopsy, he found evidence of Wisniewski spots on the lining of Elijah's stomach. He would state that the presence of these spots is indicative of hypothermia. State's Exhibits 10A to 10C, which are in the court's custody at this time, show the condition of Elijah's body at the time of autopsy, reflecting his emaciation and the status of skeletal mass. Your Honor, Dr. Atkinson, following autopsy, concluded that Elijah's death was a homicide. He concluded that Elijah died as a result of violence and neglect, including facial and scalp injuries, acute fentanyl intoxication, malnourishment, and pressure ulcers. A bandage was recovered from one of the injuries on his head. Specifically, Dr. Atkinson found 15 defects to Elijah's head, which were caused by lacerations and/or by blunt force trauma. He found blunt force injuries to Elijah's left elbow and right thigh, and 3 pressure ulcers on his back and on his heels. Dates exhibits 11A through 11B show some of the injuries to his cord that were referring to Elijah's head. With respect to the pressure ulcers, the largest ulcer of the 3 was located in the small of Elijah's back. It was found to measure 2.16 inches by 1.77 inches in size, and that ulcer extended from the skin on the middle of his back into the bone of his sacrum. Your Honor, just as a quick demonstrative, the size of that injury is reflected here by the spread mark on a piece of paper. Where the state notes that at trial, there would have been an independent forensic pathologist that had been retained by the defendant who would have testified at trial as to her general agreement with findings of Dr. Atkinson, and that she would have added an additional cause of death, not of medical neglect. Dr. Elizabeth Lapistado would have testified that the injuries suffered by Elijah, the pressure ulcer from his body, and his malnourishment would have been obvious to his caregivers, who could have taken action. Your Honor, turning now back to the events surrounding and leading up to Elijah's death, as well as the findings of investigators inside of the home at 7 Sunset Drive. The state believes, according to the evidence, that Elijah's death actually occurred between September the 21st of 2021 and September 24th, 2001. Had there been a trial in this matter, Joseph's staff would have testified, and he would have stated the following facts. Timothy Lewis dropped Elijah off to them in the parking lot of a mall in Nashua, never came to their home, and only exchanged minimal words before leaving Elijah in their care. They found out that Elijah was shy, not very talkative at all, that he needed help bathing and brushing his teeth. According to Mr. Staff, at the beginning, the defendant would engage with Elijah, but she soon lost interest in him. She became frustrated with toileting problems that they were having, where he was peeing, where he was pooping, and having accidents. The defendant would always be yelling or screaming at Elijah, according to Mr. Staff, over these issues, over taking food or hiding toys. According to Mr. Staff, the defendant would leave Elijah naked for days. He would testify to some instances he observed of assault, the defendant slapping Elijah, hitting him in the butt or back, or picking him up by his throat, and Mr. Staff would admit that he did those things as well. Mr. Staff would testify about an incident when he was upstairs with their daughter, which he had indicated to investigators during initial interviews of this case, where the defendant was downstairs giving Elijah a shower, ran upstairs screaming for help, and he found Elijah knocked out with breathing downstairs. He would indicate that the defendant would tell him that Elijah was ruining her life. Mr. Staff would describe that Elijah became sickly skinny. He would state that he didn't believe the defendant was feeding Elijah while he was away from the home. And in text message communications, Your Honor, the state would show that Mr. Staff, during the course of this time, would tell the defendant to feed Elijah, let him sleep, or give him blankets. And that information comes from the text message communications recovered from Mr. Staff's phone. Mr. Staff would testify that at the end, Elijah could no longer walk or stand on his own, that there were abscesses or holes on Elijah's back that were infected. In text message communications, he would tell the defendant that Elijah had rotten holes in his back. He believed that those were because Elijah was laying in his own urine and couldn't move. During an interview with investigators on October 22nd of 2001, Joseph's staff provided some information to help officers locate Elijah's body. Mr. Staff would testify that he put a white birch tree over the area where he buried Elijah. He would describe that afterwards he couldn't stop vomiting, but that the defendant kept telling him it was going to be okay, or words to that effect. He would testify that they threw away the blanket that Elijah was wrapped in, and the tote box in which they had stored his body, in a dumpster at another Massachusetts apartment complex. These items were not found by investigators, but they did recover surveillance video that showed the vehicle the defendant and staff were traveling in at another apartment complex in Massachusetts. Between October 15th and October 25th of 2021, officers from the Merrimack Police Department and the New Hampshire State Police conducted searches of 7 Sunset Drive. Among other items, they recovered a blue fitted sheet from a bedroom in the basement that had a bunk bed frame in it. Of note, the bunk bed frame had Elijah written on it in crayon. Or in the state, we'll call this Elijah's room. They also found an unsigned temporary guardianship affidavit form in the basement. They found 2 bags with brown powder suspected narcotics in the basement next to a queen-size bed, 1 bag of suspected narcotics from the top shelf in the basement bathroom, and 1 bag containing suspected narcotics from the top of the refrigerator in the basement kitchen. During this search, investigators found that the basement bathroom had broken tile in the area surrounding the bathtub. They found in that area multiple, being 29 small red-brown stains consistent with blood on the tiles that remained. The small red-brown stains were on the 3 walls that surrounded the bathtub itself, on the shower curtain, and on the ceiling 7 feet above the floor. Red-brown staining suspected to be blood was also observed on the detachable shower head. That item was recovered by investigators. If called to testify, Trooper Mallory Littman of New Hampshire State Police Major Crime Unit would have stated that the bathroom appeared to have been cleaned. There were numerous empty bottles of cleaning solutions, including bleach, Windex, and household cleaner on the floor in that room. Investigators had to use a chemical enhancement in order to document the cleanup of the suspected blood and to locate as many samples of that red-brown blood staining as possible. The New Hampshire State, all of the samples recovered and all of the evidence recovered was submitted to the New Hampshire State Police Forensic Laboratory, who conducted chemical tests on the suspected narcotics recovered from the basement of 7 Sunset Drive. All 4 baggies recovered inside the basement were found to contain a mixture of illegal drugs that included heroin and fentanyl, among other substances. The New Hampshire State Police Forensic Laboratory then conducted testing on the suspected blood staining found on the blue fitted sheet from Elijah's room, as well as on 2 swab samples of suspected blood from the bathroom. One of those samples were from the shower curtain, and the other was from the back corner wall near the top of the bathtub. Those samples were compared to a known DNA sample that was recovered from Elijah Lewis during his autopsy. Each of the samples of red-brown staining on the blue fitted sheet and the 2 samples from the bathtub were found to be consistent with a single source male DNA profile. And further, each sample was found to be from Elijah Lewis. 7 additional swab samples of suspected blood from the bathroom, including 2 samples from the ceiling and the sample from the shower head, were sent to an outside forensic laboratory for testing. A forensic scientist conducted DNA testing on those swab samples and compared them to the known profile of Elijah. Each of those samples were found again to consist of a single source male DNA profile, and further, each sample was found to be from Elijah. During the course of this investigation, members of New Hampshire State Police Major Crime Unit reviewed thousands of communications of the defendant. Those communications consisted of her conversations with Joseph Staff, Joanne Staff, and Facebook communications with Tracy Dauphinais and Bruce Scherzer, among others. These communications again consisted of Facebook messages, text messages, and multimedia messages, where the defendant would send photographs and videos of Elijah. Examples of these messages that are relevant to the defendant's guilty plea are included here as follows. Additional messages may be discussed or presented during the October 20th sentencing hearing. April 20th, 2021. And all this kid does is cry because he's fucking hungry. And these are all messages so that the court is aware from Ms. Dauphinais. This is from Facebook. The next is from Facebook from Ms. Dauphinais. I gave him a small bowl of cereal so he would shut the fuck up, but that wasn't enough. He said he wants food, and he wants me to stop starving him because it's not nice. From her messages sent to Joseph Staff from her cell phone. These are obtained from Joseph Staff's original phone since Ms. Dauphinais was never recovered. July 27th of 2021. I'm gonna kill this kid, Joe. Fucking screaming on the top of his lungs for fucking water and waking JS and I up. July 29th, 2021. Elijah, I'm gonna kill him, and I mean it. July 29th, 2001. I hit him in the head with the shower rod. That's all I did. September 7th, 2021. Just whooped the maggot's ass. 4 days later, Ms. Dauphinais sent Mr. Staff a photograph during the conversation. On September the 11th of 2021, Ms. Dauphinais sent this message to Joseph Staff. They're showing State's Exhibit 14, which is in evidence. This photograph shows a barely recognizable Elijah Lewis. His hair textures changed, his face is covered in bruises, his nose appears oddly shaped, and his left eye appears to be swollen shut. He has cuts and marks all over the right side of his face. When this photograph was recovered, it was sent to Dr. Richard Atkinson of the medical examiner's office in Massachusetts. Dr. Atkinson reviewed this photograph and compared it with an identification or head photograph of Elijah Lewis from autopsy. Dr. Atkinson found that the injuries above and below Elijah's right eye, the injury on the bridge of his nose, shown in the photograph, are all consistent with injuries he observed during autopsy and are injuries which contributed to Elijah's cause of death. Further, Dr. Atkinson stated that the cut on the left side of Elijah's forehead in the photograph is consistent with the location of an injury he observed during autopsy. The court has a copy of State's Exhibit 15, which shows the court the comparison of these two images. In the days after September the 11th of 2021, Elijah's condition worsened, and his body began to fail, and that is evident in the text message conversations between the defendant and Joseph Staff. And yet Ms. Dauphinais still continued to assault and neglect him. In the morning of September 15th, 2021, the defendant sends a message to Mr. Staff, as is on screen, saying that JS, their daughter, spilt her whole bowl of cereal on the bed, their dog wouldn't shut up, and Elijah won't stop asking for shit. He's complained he's cold, and he wants a blanket. From the text messages that have been reviewed in this case, it is clear that towards the end of his life, Elijah was having difficulty sitting up or staying awake. Mr. Staff would have testified that he had to start feeding Elijah through a straw, and he saw that Elijah's breathing was more rapid and labored. Elijah started vomiting. Mr. Staff would testify that he confronted the defendant about Elijah's worsening condition, and she didn't seem to care if he died. In text messages on September 16th of 2021, Mr. Staff told the defendant that they could not, quote, torture him again. He reminded her that Elijah had a rotten hole in his back, and the defendant responded that Mr. Staff was babying Elijah and asserted that she was the boss. The text messages in that conversation show, among other things, the defendant's hatred of Elijah. I ask the court's indulgence. I'm going to read through this conversation because it is very instructive as to the defendant's guilt. Starting at 11:26 in the morning on September 16th of 2021, the defendant texted, "Every goddamn fucking time you leave, this fucking piece of shit kid gets so fucking disrespectful. I hate him. I hate him. Are you on your way back yet? This kid is standing. I took his mattress away because he's talking back being a smart ass. Wouldn't listen to a goddamn thing I said, so he has to stand. I don't care what you say. He does not disrespect me at all. He's a fucking rotten kid inside and out." Mr. Staff, what was he not listening to, and what was he saying? We cannot torture him again. From Ms. Dauphinais, I told him to sit and he kept bending in half. I told him to sit up and he said he can't, and he told me he doesn't want to. I asked him why can't he listen to me. He said because he doesn't feel like it. He can stand. That's not torture. That's a punishment. Every child stands in time out. Fuck him, Joe. No, don't care. From Mr. Staff, he has a rotten hole in his back vein. From the defendant, and that's his fault. He can't bend in half. From Mr. Staff, it is obviously painful. I know it's his fault. From the defendant, I just told him to sit. That's it. If he fucking listened, it wouldn't be bad. Stop this, Joe. He's standing, and that's final. From Mr. Staff, I don't care. From the defendant, I'm the fucking boss now. He's disrespecting me because you let him get away with it. Baby, the fucking piece of shit. He can rot in hell. He chooses to piss all over himself. He chooses to take and transfer germs. He chooses to bend and make it harder on him. If the fucking freak would listen, none of this would be happening. He won't ever, from Mr. Staff, he won't ever listen. He will forever be rough. From the defendant, I gave him chances after chances. I told him fucking 10 times to sit from taking the mattress away, and he just ignored me. Then mouthed back, gave him another chance. I took the fucking mattress away, and he continued to not listen, so now he can fucking stand. His back hurts, like you said. You want the poor baby to lay down all fucking day, get sips from daddy, and making sure to ask him if he has to pee? No fucking way. He needs to move, not lay there like a dead, rotten animal. He had his chance of being babied and getting what he wanted. He ruined it. Game over. I'm done with this life. I'm a pissed off, fucking crazy, fucked up person because of him, and my daughter has to live with it. Fuck him and his fucking back and his fucking rotten body. That's the life he chose, so that's what he gets. He should have asked to pee, or I wouldn't have been this pissed. Making you clean up for hours, and he just stand there and watched, never saying sorry. You can say whatever you want. It's my way now. My fucking piece of shit kid. I'll do what I want. Not gonna have him disrespect me because Joe gives in. I'll fucking hang the kid. Your Honor, following these messages from the defendant to Joseph's staff, Elijah was only discussed one more time by name. Phone records show that on September the 21st of 2021, Mr. Staff was shopping at the Target store in Nashville when the defendant sent him a text message complaining that Eli had kept their daughter awake all night. That was the last time he was mentioned or discussed, until October the 10th of 2021, when DCYF began their investigation into the family. Your Honor, while Mr. Staff was at Target that day, from 6:32 until 7:30, Mr. Staff sent the Dauphinais 21 text messages and began making repeated calls from her cell phone. He became increasingly concerned because she wasn't responding, or appears to. Mr. Staff left the store, arriving at Sunset Drive in Merrimack at approximately 7:45 p.m. He described to officers and would have testified at trial that when he arrived home, he found the defendant lying in bed with their daughter and Elijah injured in the basement bathroom. He would indicate that Elijah was sitting in the bathtub surrounded by broken tile, that Elijah was naked and he was disoriented and had an injury to his head. Mr. Staff put a bandage on Elijah's head and put him to bed. No one sought medical attention for Elijah or took any other action to seek help, and Mr. Staff would testify that shortly thereafter, whether that night or later in the week, Elijah died. At some point, Your Honor, that week, between September 21st and September 24th, Elijah died as a result of those injuries, as a result of his neglect, as a result of his malnourishment, the open pressure wounds on his body, and his exposure to the illegal drug fentanyl. Joseph Staff would have testified that when he told the defendant that Elijah was no longer there, the defendant appeared relieved, and she said, "Wrap him in a blanket and get him out," or words to that effect. Mr. Staff wrapped Elijah in a blanket. He placed Elijah's body into trash bags, and he placed it outside the entrance to their basement apartment. He later placed the bags containing Elijah's body into a plastic tote bin that remained on the property at 7 Sunset Drive in Merrimack until October the 14th of 2021, at which time Elijah's body was placed into the bed of Joseph Staff's pickup truck, along with the trash bags containing his clothing, toys, and books, before the defendant and Mr. Staff fled the state of New Hampshire. On the morning of September the 24th, 2021, Your Honor, at about 9:30 in the morning, the defendant and Joseph Staff exchanged text messages. The defendant sent a text message telling the defendant that she was great. She followed that by saying, "Seriously, like I can breathe and be free. I was a prisoner for so long, baby. It was hell. It wasn't how I wanted JS to be raised. She deserved the whole world. We deserve nothing but happiness and health. Time to kick ass and make moves. Time to create a life that our beautiful children deserve." And that would be some of the evidence that the state would have expected to present on trial in this matter. And
Okay, thank you. Any objection to the offer of proof?
Your Honor, Ms. Dauphinais does not agree with all of the facts, but she does admit that she no longer participated in her bipolar son's death. She does admit that she instructed Tracy Dauphinais to provide false information. She does admit that she instructed research to provide false information. She also further admits that the evidence presented at trial would be sufficient to prove all of the elements of the defense beyond reasonable.
Okay, Ms. Dauphinais, do you agree with what your attorney just said? So you agree there is sufficient evidence to support each element for the 3 charges that you're pleading guilty to beyond a reasonable doubt. All right, I have in front of me, or will in just a moment, the acknowledgement and waiver of rights form that Madam Clerk discussed with you at the beginning of this proceeding. Did your attorney go over the rights that you're waiving today? So I have to be sure that you understand your rights in order to take your plea. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions about those rights. If you don't understand my question or you need to talk to your attorney at any time, let me know, okay? How old are you? How far did you go in school? So are you able to read and write? You're able to understand conversations you've had with your attorney and what's happening here today. Do you know you don't have to plead guilty? And by pleading guilty, you're waiving certain constitutional rights, correct? Specifically, you're waiving your right to a speedy and public trial on these charges, correct? Do you understand that a trial would be held before 12 jurors? Do you further understand that all 12 jurors would have to vote guilty in order for you to be convicted? Do you understand you have a right to counsel throughout trial? A trial would have been your opportunity to see and hear witnesses testify under oath, correct? And do you understand that your attorney could challenge those witnesses to cross-examination? You could also call your own witnesses or produce evidence to defend yourself, right? You have the right to have the court compel the attendance of evidence and witnesses on your behalf, correct? Do you understand you would not have to prove your innocence, but instead it would be the duty of the prosecutor to prove by competent evidence your guilt beyond a reasonable doubt to each and every element for each and every charge? You have the right to silence. You could not be forced to testify, but you have the right to testify if you chose to. Do you understand that? Do you know that if you chose not to testify, I would instruct the jury they could not draw any inference from your silence? Do you understand it would be your right to ask me to exclude any evidence obtained illegally? Because you're pleading guilty today, I'm not going to analyze the evidence in that way, understood? Do you understand you're waiving your right to appeal this matter to the New Hampshire Supreme Court? You're also waiving sentence review. That's a panel of 3 other judges who could review your sentence for its fairness, increasing it, decreasing it, or leaving it the same. You understand that by waiving sentence review, there'll be no review of the sentence by other judges. Do you understand all of these rights? Not just the ones I've gone over, but all of the rights that are in this form? And with all of those rights in mind, do you want to waive your rights and plead guilty? Are you pleading guilty because you admit that you committed the acts charged? Have you reviewed each of the indictments with your attorney? Do you understand each one of these charges? Have you reviewed the discovery in the case with your attorney? Have you discussed with your attorney any and all defenses you have in this matter? Have you reviewed the maximum penalties for each of these charges? You understand that there is, for murder in the second degree, there's a mandatory minimum as charged of 35 years with a maximum punishment of imprisonment for life. And tampering witnesses, the maximum there is 3.5 to 7 years and up to a $4,000 fine. Have you taken any medication, drugs, or alcohol in the last 24 hours? So you're clear-headed? Has anyone threatened, forced, or coerced you or anyone near or dear to you to get you to plead guilty today? Other than the agreement of a capped plea, has anyone made you any other promises which have influenced you in any way to plead guilty rather than go to trial on these charges? Do you understand if you're not a U.S. citizen, you may suffer other consequences of these convictions, including but not limited to deportation? Do you feel like you've had sufficient opportunity to talk about these matters with your attorneys? Have you told them all the facts and circumstances involved in these matters so that they could adequately advise you? Have your attorneys discussed with you what the state would need to prove to obtain a conviction for each charge and your possible defenses? Have they answered all of your questions? Are you satisfied with the services of your attorneys? If I accept your pleas of guilty, are they entirely free and voluntary on your part? If I accept your pleas of guilty, is that choice entirely free and voluntary on your part? Do you have any questions of me at this time or of your attorneys? And do you know of any reason why I shouldn't accept your pleas of guilty today? All right, counsel, have you had an adequate opportunity to talk about these matters with your client?
Yes, sir.
Have you reviewed each and every element for each offense and possible defenses? Have you reviewed the maximum penalties for each offense? Do you believe that your client is knowingly, intelligently, and voluntarily waiving her rights? Do you know of any reason why I shouldn't accept her plea of guilty? And does the defendant waive formal reading of the indictments? All right. So as to charge ID 1968131C, as amended, second degree murder, knowing, guilty or not guilty. As to charge ID 1916901C, tampering with the witness, how do you plead, guilty or not guilty? As to charge ID 1916903C, tampering with a witness, how do you plead, guilty or not guilty? The court, having determined that the charges have a factual basis, having questioned the defendant and counsel on the offer of her pleas of guilty, the defendant and her counsel, having advised the court, have conferred concerning the aspects of these charges and any potential defenses. The court, having observed the defendant in making her answers, her demeanor, apparent intelligence, and attitude, and having observed that the defendant does not appear to be under the influence of anything that would affect her judgment, the court finds the defendant has knowingly, intelligently, and voluntarily waived her rights and entered pleas of guilty which are accepted. Sentencing in this matter is scheduled for October 25th, 2024 at 10 o'clock. Is there anything further from counsel? Anything further from the state? All right, the hearing is concluded. Thank you.